So here's my spot for American Experience Into the Amazon. And I've got a lot of EQ and I've got a lot of compression and various reverbs happening on all of these tracks. It's a very squashed spot. There's a lot of design, sound design, and all of this serves the purpose of really giving every little bit of it clarity. The voices. So in this spot we have, a lot of stuff happening.
On American Experience.
What Roosevelt wanted was to test himself against nature.
This is a guy who likes physical danger.
They are running out of food. They're running out of time.
Roosevelt says, this is it. You have to leave me here.
Into the Amazon on American Experience.
To get those voices to kind of sit up above the mix, I run a kind of standard compression and EQ scheme. I always kind of pretty much shelf out with some kind of EQ. I use the channel strip pretty much all the time these days, but I used to use the 7-band EQ on the Avid because that was a nice one as well. But so you could use that. And I usually shelf out the very low end, just in case if it's a field recording of any sort, if it's interview tracks that came from somewhere where, there was rumble in the background and they didn't notice it, or some low-level noise. I always pretty much just shelf out that part of the voice. And then I usually use some negative gain reduction in the frequencies where the voice is the most muddy, kind of in this low mid-range. So for my voiceover talent, and the way I find the muddiness is I generally use the technique from music recording where you adjust the gain upwards, okay, and then sweep it.
On American Experience.
So you sweep the frequency back and forth.
On American Experience.
It's useful to do this if you have a sustained amount of the material.
Into the Amazon on American Experience.
What I ended up with was around 222 as the frequency that was the most kind of nasally and indistinct.
On American Experience.
Thinking that's basically going to kind of muddy up her voice. There's all this other low end happening in the sound design.
On American Experience.
So pulling that out gives it a lot more clarity.
On American Experience.
See? So I generally pull out a little of that, and then the places where the voice has the most clarity, anywhere between 800 all the way up to 8,000. Generally in here, around the 5K range, I do some boost. So right on this one, I'm doing 4, but it's in the general vicinity. So I do some boost in here.
On American Experience.
Sharpens it up, and that basically just gives me a baseline, and then, maybe some ultra high, like in here we've got some 12. That gives me a little bit more definition in the voice. And then I run a small amount of compression on this channel strip. I set it with a bit of a knee. And a knee is basically, for video people, think of it as like an ease in, ease out. So this -24 is when this compressor is going to kick in. So that's the threshold of this compression. And so if my knee is set to full hard, it's going to kick in very rapidly. When it kicks in, it's going to reduce the gain of this signal, the voice, by 2 to 1. So you're gonna really hear it kick in. So a knee basically is the same thing kind of as an ease in, ease out. As it approaches the threshold point, -24, it's going to start compressing. So you're not going to hear the attack of the compressor as much. And so you basically won't perceive the compression. It'll feel like it's more part of the voice. So I always use a little bit of that, but really most of my compression is being done with this Maxim limiter. And the limiter is basically a very, very steep compressor, so it's like usually 10 to 1 or more. So it's compressing quite a bit in order to really kind of control the signal and kind of reduce peaks and bring the quieter parts of the signal up louder and the louder parts of the signal down lower, and it kind of brings it into, if you compress something really heavily, you end up with what looks like a cigar in your mix. Music often comes in looking like this, unless it's jazz or classical. But basically, it's got a much more kind of look like this, It's been compressed, its dynamic range is narrowed, so it doesn't have a lot of variance. So I run this to limit the channel, and this has a wet-dry mix feature, which is basically parallel compression. So you can mix between the uncompressed signal, the dry, and the completely compressed signal. So if you want to run this as a full limiter, you just drag it all the way to the right. If you want to run it as a partial limiter, kind of like a superimpose effect in the Avid, you're mixing between an affected source, like a glow effect, and your original source. So it's a great feature for getting compression, but not completely committing to it. The only thing is, of course, if you're using this as a limiter and you're looking to limit at a ceiling, when this is set to midway between dry and wet, what you're going to end up getting is potentially some peaks poking through. So you really just have to be aware of that. But of course, I also always run a limiter on my master, bus limiting. So it's really, mostly what you're looking at here is not overdriving the channel on an individual source like this. Generally, you can run it in parallel compression mode, and as long as you monitor kind of the channel output and listen for distortion, you'll be fine. So generally, I inflate the signal with the voices with this.
What Roosevelt wanted was to test himself against nature.
So, in the mix itself, if I have
What Roosevelt wanted was to test himself against nature.
So you can see the difference there as I'm bringing it through.
What Roosevelt wanted was to test himself against nature.
So I'm giving clarity to that voice. I'm bringing that voice up in range. So I usually just find a happy medium that is, so the voice is just there, but you're not, overindulging an effect like this will end up distorting the signal quite a bit. So you have to be judicious in its use. And of course, in promos, we can be a lot more brute force in the approach. It's generally expected that we want that volume to be up in that dynamic range. In that peak point, we want to hit a volume window centered on minus 24 LKFS. It has variance up 2 decibels in either direction, so minus 22 to minus 26. So over the duration of the spot, or the trailer, if you will, or the segment of the program, you're looking to hit that window. So you can have some areas where it gets really loud, but you have to have compensating areas where it gets really quiet. Or if you're in a promo and it's only 30 seconds, you're really looking to keep that window within that window by compressing the voices, because they're the main element. I run a little bit of that, and then I always run a de-esser on voices to shave off the sibilance that is in the voice. And then, of course, I'm creating some sibilance by compressing and EQing. So I usually run a little bit of de-essing, which is basically, de-esser is a selective compressor with a very fast attack. So this one is centered on 6 kilohertz. And here we go, we'll play it.
What Roosevelt wanted was to test himself against nature.
And what it has is it has a detector circuit. We can listen to that detector circuit with this button right here, listen. And so we're listening to what the de-esser, what's driving its activation in and out. So
What Roosevelt wanted was to test himself against
tests. So basically the S's are really dominant. You sweep this to find where the S's are the most dominant for a particular voice, and then you use the range to have it kick in and out. So that's
What Roosevelt wanted was to test himself against nature.
So it's really up usually. Threshold is up very high, so the lower you bring this, the more kind of muddy you're going to make the voices, because then it's now eating into not just the S's, which are jumping out of the voice, but the, if you zoom in on here, you can see, where is it, like...
What Roosevelt wanted was to test him.
See, there's the S right there.
Test him.
So I'd say how much more inflated it is than some of the surrounding vowels and consonants, phrasing. So you're basically...
Test himself against nature.
So you're like basically having it kick in and kind of lower. You could go in here and manually lower all your S's if you want, and sometimes this isn't enough. So what I find is I sometimes do even go in and manually lower some of the S's. And when I've mixed things like this in Pro Tools, a digital audio workstation, you have complete control over all of these parameters like you do in here, but you have the ability to keyframe all of these parameters. And Avid doesn't allow that at this point in the Media Composer product. So my way around it has been to use this 3-band EQ that's a legacy EQ that's been in Avid from the very earliest days. It runs real time, green dot effect. It's a 3-band EQ. You've got a semi-parametric in the mid-range, and you can sweep this frequency back and forth. You can either do a quarter octave or you can do a 2-octave spread on that centered frequency. And then you have a shelf low and a shelf high with 4 frequencies. And so basically these 4 frequencies are just how much of the signal it's affecting. So 15K is really, really high. It's affecting only the very top end of the signal, but if I back this down to 6K, you can see that that shelf is now affecting much more of the signal. So I use this spot EQ in place of automation in the Avid. So that's why the sequence is full of these, because I'll go and I'll find that, you know, I want a little bit more bass in this section, the snap of the drums. And so I will go through and add edits in my track and just adjust EQs as an offset for these EQs. So I'm kind of, because usually a setting that's across the track is not relevant for the entire track. This is something that we have in music all the time. You're always bringing the EQ up and down to give clarity to things where the mix is more dense, or you might want to be taking clarity away from one element so that another element can pop through in that moment. So this is the way to do it in the Avid. You know, of course, if you're in DaVinci or if you're in Premiere, they have the ability to automate these things over time. Or if you're in Pro Tools, of course, you can do this. But this is the way around it in Avid, and it actually works great. I've been doing it for years, and it works great. The other thing I run a lot of in spots like this is Reverb. Normally, you deal with Reverb in digital audio workstations on auxiliary returns, and then you have sends on a mixing console so you can send, say, a whole group of microphones to the same reverb, like a drum kit or guitar or voices. The way I deal with it in the Avid is I put the reverbs directly on the tracks. So if I'm working on a bigger spot than this, like a trailer, I usually might set up a couple of generic reverbs, small, medium, large, or short, medium, and long. But in a spot like this, I'm not using a huge amount of them. So I have 3 on here, and these are more like ambient reverbs on these tracks. So this one is 1 second large ambient reverb. I'm only using 23% of it on the track. So I'm isolated to these 2 effects. So in here, we have the sound effects from the documentary. Okay, so you've got the insects and then some walla and some space. But at the top, I really wanted you to feel the size of the jungle. And one way of doing that is to have something that echoes, right? I got a couple of sound effects from Sound Effects Library, and I've got this with no reverb on it. In order to echo, you have to have a discrete sound that stops. In order to feel the echo, you need that sound to kind of stop, like if it's a punch or a drum hit or something like the smack of some object hitting some other object. You have that one discrete sound, and then it echoes out into time and space. So I got this animal sound. It's not too big of a sound, you know. It would be, if it was, say, a church, it would be a little bit too much. You know, that's not what it sounds like, you know, because in an outdoor space like this, the reverb is going to get absorbed by all the trees fairly quickly. So ambient, large, 1 second was about where I found it. I felt like it needed it, or I felt this like hit the mark. So I run that on the channel, and that gives us, you know, that.
On American Experience.
What Roosevelt wanted was,
You know, so you feel the space. Now, there's an order of processing in the Avid. On your channels, you have clip gain, and then you have volume gain. they're two mixers, and they're represented here as clip and auto. Live is for recording the volume, the automation gain in real time right on the mixer here or through an outboard piece of gear. So clip is pre-effects in terms of the inserts, and automation is post-effects. So adjusting the clip gain into a reverb is going to give you more of the echo. So what I do is I usually have something echo out. I find the point where I want it to echo, say it's on this second bird call or animal call, and I just put an add edit there and a dissolve into filler. That creates the echo because the sound is basically cut off, and that's feeding into the reverb. To accentuate the envelope of the reverb, I compress it. You know, if I compress this even more, it's going to carry that tail out longer. It's also going to raise the level of this as well. So this is something that would be nice to be able to automate in the Avid, because that's how I do it in Pro Tools. But in here, it's a balance between the clip level. If you want to have something come out to a particular time, I have an example of that down here. So if you want the reverb tail to, here's a reverb that basically I used on this track here, full wet, and it's 33 seconds, large haul. That's echoing all the way through, as you can see, to the next piece of media. And then I'm using keyframes on a piece of media here, a blank piece of media. It's got no audio actually in this piece of media. The reason I'm doing this is because the reverb is echoing out into that track, and then the automation gain is the only place where we can control it. And automation gain is attached to clips in the Avid, attached to pieces of media. So if I were in a DAW, like a Pro Tools, I could write keyframes into the track and adjust the volume of that reverb right here where I need it to. But it's attached to media here in the Avid, so you need to basically just have a piece of media there at the end point where you want that echo to happen. Put keyframes in that, and you can adjust it to time. So, you know, if I wanted it to be shorter, I could drag this keyframe back. If I wanted it to be extremely short, like that, say. It's the way you're controlling the output of the reverb. I like to handle all of this stuff in real time, just like I handle all these other processes, because then, you know, I can kind of adjust the clarity and the density of all of them, and, you know, the definition in real time, or close to real time. And here I'm really kind of starting in my playback, but everything is being played back in real time. I'm not having to render anything to get this stuff to play back for me. And, you know, if I had an outboard mixer, I could adjust a lot of these things in real time on that. So that's reverb. In terms of running all of these things, you shouldn't be afraid to do this right in your spot, real time. You know, all this stuff is really pretty capable inside the NLEs these days. It'll give your mixes a lot more clarity and style if you use this kind of processing on a regular basis. You can refine the mixes quite a bit.